there, and welcome to Into the Terminal. On today's episode, we're going to be unleashing NFS by doing some NFS stuff.
Unleashing. I didn't realize it was on a leash to begin with.
Well,
Unleashed.
it is. So we'll jump right into the terminal. I got our client and server for NFS. So what we're looking at is my server system, and I can switch to my client over here by just clicking the top tab. All right. Nicely, they say both client and server. And the first thing I'm going to start off with is I'm going to install the software that we need for NFS. So the package I want is called NFS utils, and I'm going to do that on both the client and the server. Because it turns out that the NFS utils package contains both the server-side software and the client-side tools that I need for working with NFS. All right, so got installed on both places. So let me go ahead and make a directory that I want to share with NFS. So I'm just going to create a directory called mount extra. And there it is. So we could put files here and everything be fine. It's a regular directory, but we want to share this directory through NFS. So I'm going to create an entry in my etc exports file. So with NFS, you're taking your file shares and you're exporting them so that other people can use them on their system. And the format of etc exports looks like this. So you tell it the directory that you want to share via NFS, the people you want to share it to, and then maybe some options. And we're going to get into much more on options and access controls after the break. So for right now, we're going to share this to everyone that happens to be able to connect to my machine. And we're going to share to them a read write so they can place files here as well as read files out of it. And then sync means that when an update occurs on either the any client, it will synchronously publish that update to the files that reside on the server. All right. So now I've got my configuration file of the directory I want to share. Next thing I need to do is start up the service. So we're going to server.
So you confused yourself by saying service. The
That's
server
right.
is a service. And it probably ends in dot service if you were to look at systemd.
Indeed. And we'll just take a look to make sure that it's running. So we're active. That's good. So at this point, the NFS server is configured and it's sharing that one directory of content to any client that happens to connect to it. So then the flip side that we need to talk about is the client side config. So I'm going to go over here to my client. Remember, I earlier installed NFS utils on it. And we are going to use a command called showmount. Showmount will show you data from an NFS server. -E says, show me the exports from the NFS server. And so I'm going to happen to know my NFS server's IP. I could also use its host name if I had a host name. And this is what that server is currently sharing. So sharing mount extra to any client that connects. And so I can go ahead and mount that. Let's make a mount point first. So a mount point is just a directory in your file system hierarchy where you want to attach a device. And so sometimes you attach things like disks or disk partitions, or logical volumes. In this case, we're going to attach an NFS mounted export. All right. So the device that we're going to mount is this remote server and its share, mount extra. And we're going to put that on our local machine at that /NFS directory I just created. right? And we can make sure that that is correct by looking at mount. And we can see down here at the bottom of my list
There you go.
that, yeah, this remote server's mount extra is mounted on /NFS. It's a type NFS v4. And then there's a bunch of options. And again, we'll get into a little bit more detail on options after the transition. All right, so Nate, there's one last thing we got to do. We've got the server sharing the file system. We got the client mounted on the file system, but we got to do one more thing.
I mean, you've mounted it, but you haven't actually written anything to it. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, let's put some stuff there.
But I mean, just mounting it, isn't that enough? Aren't we done?
I mean, we could be, but then we
Ticket
wouldn't know that
resolved.
it actually
Hand it
works.
off. There's your mount.
That's right. But we always want to test something. And
You broke it.
Yeah. But it was working. You saw it. It was mounted.
It was totally mounted.
Yeah, so we're going to fix this in an incredibly horrible way, and we're going to come back and address it after the transition. So let me switch back over to my server. All right. So admittedly, this is the most horrible way possible to fix this issue. It turns out that the reason we're seeing that error message is actually expected because of how NFS works.
Listen,
But
I've read a ton of online blogs that say that's exactly how you fix permissions problems. Okay, happens all the time. That's 777 means fixed.
written by the finest Linux admins on earth.
Yes.
All right. So now that I've changed the file permissions over on the server side, I'm just going to like run the same command. So there we go. And notice it worked. And if I look here, right, there's my file I copied in. And if I look over here on the server, mount extra, there it is. But it's weird. It's owned by nobody.
That nobody guy,
So we're
he's
gonna,
popular.
is he? So this is actually one of the things that's the issue of why we had to add more permissions is because of how NFS handles some usery things. So we'll talk about that after the transition. Nate, any words of wisdom or pointing and laughing?
So I mean, I love the simplicity of NFS for how easy it is to get a server set up and get the mount going, which is exactly what you just showed us. But that simplicity starts to break down when you start to get into complicated permissions and whatnot. So, and that's exactly what we're going to talk about. So,
yeah. So don't forget to like and subscribe. So if you want us to keep making this stuff, like it, tell us you like it, and get notified when we do more. And if you know somebody else that would benefit, share it with them. Stay with us after the transition, where we're going to talk about making NFS mounts permanent on clients. We'll also talk more about this nobody user and the permission error that we saw earlier and how to more correctly resolve it. And then we'll spend some time talking about options, because what's better than optional options?
we love options. Got to have options.
Right. Stay with us. All right, we're back.
We are back.
I did want to point out we were getting ready for the show, and I said, "Oh, let me grab my Red Hat hoodie," and I came back, and what did you say?
That doesn't look like a Red Hat hoodie. That looks like some sport ball hoodie, but it is in fact a Red Hat hoodie.
It is in fact a Red Hat hoodie. So Nate, what is the reason why someone would choose NFS?
So, I mean, I kind of already started to say this before the break that it's just simple. It's already included. I mean, you could argue that so is iSCSI, but try to set up an iSCSI disk and you'll immediately start to see why NFS is so attractive. It's just so much easier, right? You all you need is a directory, a service, and some very simplistic-ish permissions and setup, right? And boom, there you go. Especially if you're dealing with like local files. I don't know if I'd want to do NFS over the internet or anything, but I guess it's an option.
I mean, it's an option, but yeah, I think that's probably a bad idea. Most of the time, you deal with it on your like local network or your corporate network. The
Yeah.
other thing when we were planning the episode, there are a lot of storage devices out there as well that you can
Yep.
configure your storage on and then expose it to your end customers as NFS.
Yep.
So while you may not do the NFS server side things, um,
Yeah.
on your Linux box, you're probably going to be in a situation where you do the NFS client side things. Um,
Yeah, I've got a NAS here that I use in my home lab and for, local storage. Like we've got our family pictures and whatever on there. And yeah, if you want to connect to it from a Linux box, it's NFS.
yeah, and I've got a QNAP that when I was going through and like doing the configuration of the shared drives to expose via NFS, like the stuff that I put in the Etsy exports file was the same stuff I had to put into the web UI for the QNAP, right? The client
Yep.
side, machines that should connect, the options that they should use. So like it's very similar. So if you know both
Yeah.
sides, you'll be able to do probably do NFS pretty much everywhere.
Yeah, mine's a Synology, and the options, if you know what you're looking at, you can tell these are the same options I'd be putting in Etsy exports, but they word them a little differently, right? So it's a little easier to put in their UI. But yeah, same concept.
That's right. On Synology, it's a write read, totally different than read write.
I know, totally backwards.
Uh, all right. So don't forget that now is the time in the program where you can also interact with us via chat. If you are a
Yeah,
deferred viewer, please feel free to leave a comment. We respond to comments all the time. All right. I see a great question already in the chat. Um, Kamaranju asks, what is the size of Mount Extra? And what if it overgrows? How do you handle it? All right. So why don't we jump back into the terminal and we'll take a look at that. So my configuration for NFS is pretty basic. And so
hmm
if we do a DF, you'll see it down there listed in our attached file systems. And you'll see it's 80 gig and 41 gig is used and 39 gig is available. But you're like, wait, you literally create a directory and there's one file there. How is 80 gig used? Well, that
mm,
has to do with how the server is configured. So let me switch over my server. And I did not create a specific device for my NFS server to share. Instead, I made a directory, and that directory was part of my slash file system, my root file system. And so what we're looking at in the DF on the client is actually the same stuff as what we see for the slash file system for the server. So
right.
um, what we look at on the client is essentially the information that's provided via the server for whatever storage is backing that shared directory, that
Right.
exported
Now,
one.
the thing to think about when you're doing it this way is the directory that you've exported. This means that whoever's mounting it as a client could, in this case, fill up your root partition by just throwing files there because they have no idea what your server is configured to do, right? They don't know
Right.
the NFS server side. They just know they've been given a directory that they can write things to and they can easily fill that up. So it's really good practice to put either all of your NFS shares onto a separate partition or individual partitions for each one. Or I suppose you could leverage disk quotas or something to try to keep it on one disk if you had to.
So they actually do implement NFS quotas, but they're implemented
hmm
via users the same way that like normal disk quotas would operate, which
Right,
brings us back to our like weird user behavior with NFS. So
right.
we'll put a pin in that for a moment. To answer the rest of Kamar, man, I'm so sorry that I'm messing up your name. Kamaranju, his question about how do you address it. So if you are at your limit, you would manage that by managing the space on the server. So if you created a separate file system the way that Nate recommended, let's say it's NFS, you would just add more disks to your NFS volume, and then you could grow that file system, which would then be inherited by all the clients that are connected to it.
But
If
that's
you
100%
don't,
dependent on the file system and how you set up the disk on the server side, right? So if you set them up in a way that's not easy to grow, it's going to be hard to grow. You set it up in a way that's easy to grow, then it's easy to grow, right? But it's 100% what file system you set up on the server side.
yeah. And so I would say that the way that you address loss of space or someone using the space is the same way you would address any other situation like that on a machine,
Right.
right? So if you're using things like logical volume manager or Stratus, you can simply add storage from your storage pools into these extra devices. If
Right.
you're using something like we are here in the cloud, where it's a straight file partition on a disk, then like your size is your size, and if you run out, you run out. Um,
Right.
so
On the other hand, though, if you're backing this, like if you're in a data center and you've got some sort of a SAN or whatever behind the scenes that's providing this disk, your SAN might have stuff in place that you can just expand the disk and then you expand the file system and you're done, right? So there's options, but it's the exact same options you'd expect from any other Linux file system, I think is the point we're trying to drive home.
all right, so let's jump back into the terminal and we'll take a look at getting this persistently mounted on our client machine. So to show that everything is on the up and up, I'm going to unmount my file system, right? So if I look at, right, it's not there anymore. And instead, we're going to go into our etc tab file. And this is the file system table. It shows me all the devices that need to be attached when I boot the machine. And so I'm going to add a new entry here. And again, I'm going to use my machine's IP address, but if I had assigned host names, I could use its host name as well. You give it the remote directory that it's sharing. You tell it where to attach it in your local directory tree. So I created this directory called /NFS. It's a file system type NFS. And then we're just going to take the defaults options for now. And the last two fields in etc tab are dump flag and FSCK order. Because these are files that live on somebody else's machine, I'm going to let them worry about it. So I'm not going to try to make backups if I call the dump command with the right argument. And I'm not going to try and FSCK it if my machine has a poor shutdown. Okay. So it's in the etc tab. Now I should be able to do something like a mount -a. So in RHEL 9, the etc tab file is managed by systemd. So even though I made a change to the configuration file, I actually need to reload systemd so that it'll reflect that change. So I'm going to do a systemctl daemon reload as suggested by the error message.
Such a
Right,
helpful
and
error
there it
message.
is mounted. I know. There it is mounted again, right? So,
Yay.
and if we reboot the machine, it would come back automatically every time I boot the machine. And Shantanu is asking about options. We're getting there. We're getting there.
Don't get ahead of us.
So
Baby
that's right.
steps.
We're going to come back and talk about some options that are useful because there are some defaults that are probably not great choices for
Right.
NFS. So we'll come back to that towards the end of the show. All right, but our next thing we got to fix, Nate, is the user thing.
Right.
So can you tell us a little bit about what's going on there?
Yeah. So one of the intricacies, I guess, of NFS is that the user IDs are essentially stored on the NFS server because the NFS server is what owns the file system and what owns all of the users, right? So user ID mappings need to be kept consistent across the board, right? Otherwise, you're going to get these weird cases where the user that owns it on the NFS side does not match the user ID that's on the client side, right? And then it's like, oh, user ID number 1000 on this side is Bob, and user ID 1000 on that side is Joe. And now Joe owns the files, even though I wanted Bob to own it, right? So there's a whole bunch of ways to solve that, but it really comes down to mapping these IDs in a way that can be across your entire estate, whether you use like an NIS domain, which is kind of the way it always used to be, or you could use like an IDM domain, or you can just manually make sure everyone has the same IDs, which can be really tedious. But
Yeah.
nobody
So,
essentially means, I think that means that there's a mismatch between, no, in this case, it's nobody because it's owned by root, isn't it?
well, it's not owned by root. It's owned by nobody. But yes,
Well,
because we
it's
were using root is why it chose that user ID.
right. But on the NFS server side, I think it's owned by root. And on the client side, it won't map that because of an option that we did not specify when we mounted it,
Uh,
correct? Or am I getting off the reservation here?
yeah, it's because of how the data is flowing. I think so. It is actually owned by the nobody user on the NFS server as well.
Okay.
And I'll get to how that happened in just a second. But I wanted to come back and like double click on what you said about user ID mappings. So we have a user account on both these machines named RHEL, and then I added a user account on the client only named Joe. And then I just created some files in the NFS share as both these people. So you can see that the RHEL file is owned by RHEL and the Joe file is owned by Joe. But over on the server, that is not the case. So the RHEL file is owned by RHEL, but the Joe file is owned by this random UID.
Right.
So
And
the reason that
anyone who
the
understands how these UIDs are assigned in Linux file systems, you'll know they're assigned by a number, and that name is translated by the local account system, PAM, or the Etsy password, Etsy shadow files, right? So this basically means that your server has no idea who ID 1012, group ID 1013 are. So it's just showing you the number.
right, but because it knows who RHEL is and it has the same ID on both machines, that shows up the way we expect. What's even more horrible is let's say that on another client, the box gets mounted and that other system has a user with user ID 1012. Guess what happens? They now own the Joe file because
Yep.
their user ID on that client matches the user ID of the owner of this file. And so, if you're using NFS, it's really important that you get consistent user accounts across all your clients. Otherwise, you're going to have like weird mismatches on who owns what. And there are a couple technologies that we're not going to get into today on how you could do that. One is you could just
Yeah.
like manually force all the boxes to be the same. But the other would be to use a technology like LDAP, or actually AD uses LDAP.
Hmm.
The identity manager from Red Hat uses LDAP. So that way everybody has kind of the same picture of what user accounts are created in your organization. All right. So I see a bunch of chatter in the chat about where we're going next, which is this nobody user. All right. So here's the situation. Way back in the like yesteryears of history, um, if you had a file that was owned by root, or actually, I should say, if your client was interacting with the NFS server as root on the client, they were UID 0 on the client, which meant that when they were placing files, they were doing it with user ID 0. And if somebody else mounted that same file system on their client, they also had a user ID 0, which is root.
Hmm.
But the question started being asked of if someone is root on a client, should they be treated the same as if they're root on the server system? Because root gets to do things like ignore file permissions.
Well, I mean, absolutely they should be. They're root.
Well, yes, but they're
Probably
not
not.
root on my machine. They're root on somebody
I know.
else's machine.
Yeah,
Um,
right.
and
This herein lies the problem, right? If root on
right,
both these machines is you as the administrator, I mean, it's not such a big deal. But if you're not sure, right? If you're giving this to, I don't know, your app team and they're root on their machine, they're not root on your NFS server. This could be a problem.
Right, because root gets to do things like change permissions on files they don't own, or
Right.
access files that they don't have permissions to access because they're root. So the way that the authors of NFS fixed this was when the root user account on a client interacts with the NFS server. For the duration of that interaction, their effective user ID gets changed. And it's changed over time, but for RHEL 9, they get changed to the nobody user. And nobody user is user ID 65534. And that's why we see them here. And that's why it matches with the clients, because everybody has this user ID 65534, the nobody user. On older
Ain't,
versions of RHEL and older versions of Linux, you may see this as NFS nobody, which was a
yep.
different account ID.
Ain't nobody writing files as root over NFS. Nobody.
Right. Um, and so the option that controls that is called root squash, and it is a default. So when I created my etc export, notice I didn't specify how we should handle root. And
Right.
so it got the default, which is root squash. So as root from a client interacts with this file system that I'm sharing, they get temporarily reassigned to this nobody account for the purposes of their file activity. And then when they're done with their file activity, that they're back to themselves again. So if we wanted to allow them to do stuff as root, you would have to put in the option no underscore root underscore squash, which I don't
Right.
recommend. There's a reason why this exists in the first place and why it's the default.
There are, I mean, I guess the caveat is know what you're getting into if you're turning it on. Is really, as with any case where you're circumventing security or disabling a security feature, just know what you're getting into. Sometimes there's a use case where you need to do that. Most of the time, you should try not to. For
All
example,
right.
like if you're doing like NFS file systems for remote boot, you probably don't want root to be squashed. I don't know if anyone actually does that, but it's a use case that I could imagine where you might you might not want to use it.
All right. So what I'm doing here is I'm just kind of going through and creating some group configuration so that we can fix our permission problems and not be 777 permissions on our NFS share. So because we have to have the same user IDs and group IDs across the server and the clients, that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to create this shared group. The RHEL user is going to be a member of that shared group, and I'm going to configure the client to do the same. And then I can change the group owner of Mount Extra to be this third party group. All right, so that looks good. Oh, and I'll also add the set GID bit. So when new files are put in here, it's automatically owned by this group that they share. And I'll just do the same thing over here. Now just make sure that the permissions are there the way I expect. And so if I'm the RHEL user,
If I
right, I
heckle
can
more, will
create,
it help your typing?
it will. Um, but if I'm Joe, who's not a member of the group, right? Because he's not a member of the group, and we adjusted the permissions on the directory to only allow
Right.
people who belong to group share, then we're good. And we can just take a quick look. So here's this extra file I just put in here. So that's a more sane way of managing the permissions on your NFS share so that random people that happen to exist on a client system don't get to do things that you don't intend.
Yeah, and large NFS shares is one of the cases where file system ACLs very quickly become a necessity instead of an optional thing.
Yeah,
Which, yeah, they can get complicated quick. We're not going to delve into that today.
no. All right. So options. That's our last thing before we finish up, because I'm sure producer Eric is already like, "Oh, we're over a minute."
2 minutes.
2 minutes. So
Or does the
options
first
with
minute not count?
well, we started late.
Oh, okay, okay. Because yeah,
All right. So options are the last thing that we wanted to cover, and we already talked about one, which is root squash and no root squash, which is a server side um, option. Since we're talking about server sides, yeah, let's stay on client side, and then we'll adjust server side. So
sounds good.
you'll recall that we put in etcfs tab our update. All right, so Nate, I have some ideas of options I like to use. I like this and this.
Hmm.
Are there any options you like to use as well, or is this good for you too?
So there's one which I think ended on RHEL 8. I think on RHEL 9 with the system D controlling of mounts and whatnot is no longer necessary. But
Oh,
there was one called netdev underscore
yes.
netdev, which would tell FS tab or tell the system mounts that this needs to be mounted after the network is up. So if you're on an older RHEL system, keep that in mind. There's another service called NetFS, I think, that this will start after a NetFS starts, right? So keep that in mind. On RHEL 9, it's not as important though, because I think there's already systemd dependencies that make sure that happens.
Yeah.
So
Um,
that's one. But yeah, there's a ton of other options which I can't really recall off the top of my head, but you can change things like caching and writes like writes per second and like all kinds of crazy stuff that you could set.
yeah. And there's also stuff like how much data is transmitted at a time. So you could
Right.
crank up, like you could do more network. How do I put this? Uh, you could push more data through your network at once. So
Yeah.
that's useful if you like have big files that you're transferring via NFS. You should use big
Or
packets and big data.
if you're on a link that you can guarantee a certain amount of bandwidth between you and the server, you can greatly improve performance by changing the amount of throughput you get through NFS. It takes a little bit of tweaking and fine tuning, and the defaults are usually good enough. But yeah, if you've got a high performance workload over NFS, which like boggles my mind that people do that, but you can do it if you have the network to back it up.
Yeah. And Chuck Marshall suggested sync. So I went ahead and added that in too. All right. So let's talk
Yep.
about this list. We already talked about NetDev. So this device should be attached after networking services have been started, which makes sense because you have
Hmm.
to have networking in order to do an NFS. Um, the ones that I added in were soft INTR and BG. I think you could probably get around BG now as well, thanks to systemd. Soft says it's the opposite of the default. The default is hard. And what happens with a soft mount is if we lose our connection to this NFS share, we're
Hmm.
going to try to reestablish that connection for up to 5 minutes. But after that, we'll give up and time out. The default, which is hard mounting, will never give up. And how that manifests itself is you're like having network problems or you're having a problem with your NFS server and you CD into the NFS mounted directory on the client and your shell just hangs because it's trying to
A
complete
bad
that CD.
a bad NFS
And
mount,
so,
a bad NFS mount with hard enabled can actually halt your boot. That's how bad it can be.
yeah. And so soft will like after 5 minutes of trying, it'll just give up and it'll give you an error about not being able to access whatever it is or whatever application error from not being able to access whatever it is. So that builds in a timeout. The other one I put in here is INTR. So by default, you use no INTR as your option. And that means that NFS mounts don't honor the interrupt signal. So let's say that you're having NFS server problems and you CD into the NFS directory and it's just hanging there. What's a common thing someone might do to try and move on?
Control C to interrupt.
Yeah, Control C, which sends
Doesn't
the
work.
interrupt signal. But by
Yeah.
default, it's no INTR. So the INTR option says when we're interacting with this remote device, if someone sends the interrupt signal, I will honor that and stop trying to connect to the remote device. Uh, BG is background mounting. This used to be more important on older versions of Linux because you could, at boot time, kick off your NFS mounts, which might take some time to resolve. And you could do it as a background operation so that your init subsystem could move on and keep doing other things. Um, with systemd, because we can now parallelize a bunch of stuff, it doesn't matter if this takes longer, assuming that you don't have other things that require files stored here.
Right.
But that's why BG is there. And then Chuck Marshall suggested sync. Agree. So one of the problems with NFS is that historically it does not do file locking. And so if two clients are mounted on the same server and one writes a change and the other one writes a change, whatever's done last sticks, right? Because there's no file locking. But it gets even more crazy because what happens if the first one writes the change and it gets sent over to the server, then the second one writes a change, but it gets cached in memory because it's a dirty file page. There could be more changes that come across. And then at some point, it's time to synchronize those dirty file pages and it gets sent across the network. And so you can end up with things in weird states. So the default for most, well, the default for mounts, for even disk mounts, is asynchronous updates, meaning you can cache data updates in memory. But if you put a sync here, it says as soon as the file is changed, it needs to be pushed to the actual file storage. So that's what we're doing here. And I set it on the server side as well. So it should be configured there and automatically picked up by the clients. But just in case, we can make sure it's enforced here.
There was a quick comment here from Shantanu, and I think I know the answer, but might as well just bounce it off you. So Shantanu asked, why don't we just do this using a systemd mount instead of an etcfs tab? I believe the answer is that that's what systemd did when we did the daemon reload. So you
Yeah,
don't have to do it that way, but you can.
right. And so the reason I chose to not do it that way, you'll see the other files that make up or file systems that make up my machine are referenced here. While you can put mounts in systemd and create a .mount target for them, or sorry, .mount file for them, it's still really common, especially across Linuxes, that people who are new to your box are going to look in NCFS tab for mounted file
Right.
systems. Where mount files are really nice for systemd is if you are installing something, you can install something and drop a file somewhere. That's very easy, right? Because that's what RPM does. It like unbundles files into the directory tree.
Right.
But it's really, really hard as part of an installer to like edit a file in place to interject more configuration. It's even
Right.
harder when you remove that software to remove that configuration because now like something else could have also edited that file and changed its format. But it's really easy to then delete a file that you put down as part of your install.
Right.
So yeah, just some stylistic differences. Functionally, it operates the same. All right. Uh, so that's client side. Server side, there's a couple other things we might be interested in doing. Server side options are in the etc exports file. And currently, I made a very bad choice of making it read writable to the world. Maybe I should instead make this read writable to just my client. So now only connections from 10.5.1 to 56 are allowed to be rewrite. And then if you wanted to have different levels of access for different people, like maybe I also want to offer this to other people on my network, but they should get it read only.
Right.
Actually, I was saying this, they're not doing writing. So you can set different access controls for different either IPs, host names, domain extensions, or subnet masks.
Right. So
I
you
should
can
say
do full
subnet.
networks with with CIDR notation, right? So if you'd like 10.5.0 or 10.5.1.0/24, that'll say this whole network, everything that's in that IP space will get, that particular set of options, right? And you can also go line by line, right? If you were getting too long on the first line there, or if because you wanted to organize it better, you can make a second line that also says mount extra and have another IP address. Depends how you want to organize this file.
Yep. All right. So change my anti-exports. I could do something like a systemctl NFS server reload, or there's a more classic way of doing it. Exportfs. That
Yep.
signals you're running NFS server processes and tells them to recache the etc exports. So there you go. I would
NFS
like to point out
unleashed.
that when NFS unleashed, the last thing is actually not something that we're going to get into a lot of detail today, but with RHEL 9, which is what we're using here, we are using NFS version 4. And we've actually been using NFS version 4 for quite some time on RHEL. But with this very basic setup, we're transmitting all of our file content across the network in plain text. So we don't like sending things in plain text, but the default for NFS version 3 and 4 is to do that. Version 4 does it over TCP connections. Version 3 did it by default over UDP connections, also equally terrible for other reasons. So NFS version 4 also includes the ability to encrypt some stuff. And we're not going to do it today on the machine, so we can take off the file, the screen share. But there is a document that Red Hat produces on configuring network file services. It covers both Samba and NFS. But in there, there's a fair amount of detail on using Kerberos to do either authentication of clients or users, or also to do file data encryption when communicating between the client and server. So there's several different modes of Kerberization that will do host-based authentication, user-based authentication, and also file encryption between the client and the server. But then you also have to set up Kerberos. Good.
Yeah.
Enjoy.
That would take more than a half-hour show. I mean, I guess NFS took more than a half-hour show too, but
It did, except we did it in the first like 6 minutes poorly.
all right, yeah,
Oh,
NFS. I mean, it's a great way to get file shared simply across a network. But yeah, you just have to be aware what you're getting into. It's a nice simple solution. There are more complex solutions that have a lot more advantages over NFS. But yeah, if you just need to get two Linux machines sharing files, a great way to get it done.
all right. So Nate, what's coming up next week?
Next week, I think we're continuing our services arc, right? We're going to talk about some web servers, aren't we? We're going to cook up some examples about our good old friend Apache, most likely. Maybe we'll go crazy and like run light HTTP or something. Does they even exist
Let's
anymore? I
not
don't
do.
know.
So we're going to do some web server configuration. I don't know which web server we're going to do yet. Probably
Yeah,
Apache, maybe
yeah,
NFS. But more importantly, we're also going to cover things like deploying a website that's just like
yeah,
static or dynamic where it goes.
yeah. You guys have seen us a million times just install it and use the default page for example purposes. We're going to go a little deeper than that. It's not just going to be another like, hey, we're going to DNF install it. Okay, we're done.
Right. Wait, what about super businessy website? Are we doing
Super
super
businessy
businessy web?
website. That totally has to make a reoccurrence on the show. I think super businessy.
Yeah. And then we're going to again be doing web services, but we're going to make it a little more complex.
Yeah, yeah. So if you think about like a lamp stack traditional, uh, like PHP MySQL, that's probably what you're going to expect out of that. We haven't cooked it up yet, but it'll be something like that.
And then next week, RHEL Presents will also be on I think it's Wednesday.
It's always on
producer
a
Eric
Wednesday, isn't it?
yell at me quickly behind the scenes, um, where they're going to be talking about. Oh, there you go, Wednesday. Um, they're going to be talking about a day in the life of a Red Hat solutions architect. So, solutions architects are a uh, technical position at Red Hat that works with customers as part of helping them design what they're going to be doing with Red Hat. Um, so that's what's happening on Wednesday next week. RHEL presents.
Awesome. Well, happy NFSing, everybody.
That's right. Um, and we'll keep going with new and different services on Linux for the next couple episodes. So thanks for watching and have a
Yep.
great day.
Have a great one.